Is the Linux terminal just gate? That's a question that pops up a lot, especially for people who are new to Linux and open source software. You download a Linux distribution, maybe something beginner friendly like Ubuntu or Linux Mint, and within 5 minutes, you run into advice that goes something like this. Open the terminal and type. And suddenly you're staring at a black window full of blinking cursors and cryptic commands. No buttons, no friendly icons, just text. It can feel intimidating, exclusive, even hostile. So, is the Linux terminal a tool for power users, or is it a wall keeping everyone else out? Let's start by acknowledging the feeling. For decades, mainstream computing has trained users to expect graphical interfaces. From early versions of Microsoft Windows to macOS, we've been conditioned to click, drag, scroll, and tap. The design philosophy has been clear. Hide the complexity, present the essentials, make everything visual. When you open a file manager, you don't think about file paths. When you install an app, you don't think about dependencies. The system handles it. So when Linux users casually throw around commands like sudo apt install or chmod plus x, it can feel like you've been dropped into a secret club with its own language. But here's the twist. The terminal wasn't created to exclude anyone. In fact, historically, it's the opposite. The command line predates modern graphical interfaces. Long before colorful desktops and animated transitions, computers were controlled by text. The terminal was the universal interface. It was efficient, scriptable, and accessible, even over slow network connections. In many ways, the graphical user interface is the newcomer. So why does the terminal still play such a central role in Linux? One big reason is philosophy. Linux grew out of Unix traditions. When Linus Torvalds created the Linux kernel in the early 1990s, he wasn't building a consumer operating system with polished visuals. He was building a free, open alternative to proprietary Unix systems. The culture around Linux emphasized transparency, modularity, and user control. Instead of hiding system processes behind layers of abstraction, Linux often exposes them. The terminal is the most direct way to interact with that system. To some, that exposure feels empowering. To others, it feels like homework. When someone says the terminal is gatekeeping, what they often mean is this. If you don't learn it, you're going to struggle. You'll search for solutions to problems and find tutorials that say, just edit this config file in per etsc or run this command. There may be a graphical way to do the same thing, but it's either not documented or not as flexible. So the implicit message becomes, real Linux users use the terminal. That real user narrative is where gatekeeping can creep in. It's not the tool itself. It's the culture around it. You'll see memes about people who don't even use the GUI. You'll see advice that dismisses graphical tools as bloated or inferior. And if you ask a beginner question, someone might respond with a string of commands and no explanation. That can absolutely feel exclusionary. But let's examine the practical side. The terminal is incredibly powerful because it's consistent. Whether you're on Debian, Fedora, or Arch Linux, the core tools behave in predictable ways. Commands like lscd, grep, and cat have existed for decades. Once you learn them, they transfer across distributions, servers, even embedded systems. Compare that to graphical interfaces, which can vary wildly between desktop environments like GNOME and KDE Plasma. Buttons move. Settings are renamed, menus are reorganized. The terminal, by contrast, is stable. Stability isn't flashy, but it's valuable. Another reason the terminal is so prominent is automation. If you can type a command once, you can script it. That's transformative. You can automate backups, deploy applications, process thousands of files, or manage remote servers. Graphical tools can sometimes automate tasks, but they're rarely as flexible. In the world of system administration and development, that flexibility isn't optional. It's essential. And here's something important. Linux isn't just a desktop operating system. It runs servers, supercomputers, routers, and much of the internet. On a remote server, there is no desktop. You connect over SSH and interact via text. In that environment, the terminal isn't a gatekeeping mechanism. It's the interface. So why does it feel different on the desktop? Because on the desktop, people expect comfort and convenience. If someone switches from Windows or macOS to Linux for privacy, customization, or cost reasons, they may not want to become a system administrator. They just want to browse the web, edit documents, and maybe play games. When they're told to open a terminal for routine tasks, it can feel like the system is resisting them. But here's the key question. Is the terminal required, or is it just recommended? In 2026, many Linux distributions have excellent graphical tools. You can install software through app stores, you can manage updates through notification panels, you can configure networks, printers, and displays through settings, menus. For many users, it's entirely possible to use Linux without touching the terminal at all. The catch is that when something goes wrong, the terminal often becomes the most precise way to diagnose and fix it. Graphical error messages tend to be vague. A terminal command can produce detailed logs. That's not gatekeeping. That's transparency. The system is telling you exactly what's happening instead of hiding it behind a generic something went wrong. There's also an argument that learning the terminal is less about memorizing commands and more about understanding how your system works. When you navigate directories with cd and ls, you're building a mental model of the file system. When you use package managers like apt or dnf, you're learning how software dependencies are resolved. That knowledge isn't mandatory, but it's empowering. Still, empowerment can feel like pressure if it's framed as a requirement for belonging. Let's talk about community culture. Linux communities often pride themselves on there's an expectation that you'll read documentation, search for answers, and experiment. That ethos can be incredibly healthy. It encourages curiosity but it can also morph into impatience with beginners. If someone responds to a basic question with RTFM, meaning read the manual, that's not the terminal gate. That's a social issue. The irony is that the terminal can actually lower barriers in some contexts. Text-based interfaces are accessible over low bandwidth connections. They can be used with screen readers. They don't require powerful hardware. A lightweight Linux system with a terminal can run on machines that struggle with modern graphical desktops. In parts of the world where hardware resources are limited, that's not exclusion, that's inclusion. Another perspective to consider is if you tell someone to click through a series of menus, it's hard to document precisely. If you give them a command, they can copy and paste it. That's one reason tutorials often rely on terminal commands. It's not because the authors want to intimidate you. It's because text instructions are easier to share and verify. However, copy-pasting commands without understanding them can be risky. Running a command with sudo gives it administrative privilege. If you don't know what it does, you could change system files or compromise security. Critics argue that this dynamic creates a knowledge gap. Experienced users understand the commands, beginners just trust them. That can feel like a hierarchy, but hierarchies exist in all technical fields. In graphic design, there are advanced tools. In music production, there are complex workflows. The question isn't whether expertise exists. It's whether the path to expertise is accessible. In the Linux world, documentation is typically free and public. The man pages, short for manual pages, are built into the system. The source code for most components is open. You're not locked out of knowledge. The challenge is that the learning curve can be steep. Let's zoom out for a moment. Compare the Linux terminal to the developer tools on Windows or macOS. On Windows, you have PowerShell. On macOS, you have terminal with a Unix-like shell. Developers on those platforms also rely heavily on command line tools. The difference is that many mainstream users never see them. Linux, by contrast, doesn't segregate its power user tools as sharply. The same environment used by developers is available to everyone. That openness can be overwhelming. There's also a psychological factor. A graphical interface gives you visual feedback and constraints. You can see what's clear. You can explore without fear of breaking things to Israel. The terminal, on the other hand, feels like it trusts you with raw power. A single misplaced character can change the meaning of a command that can create anxiety. But that anxiety isn't unique to Linux. It's part of interacting with any system at a deeper level. The terminal simply makes that depth visible. Some critics argue that the persistence of the terminal slows Linux adoption on the desktop. If the goal is mass appeal, shouldn't everything be accessible through polished GUSs? Perhaps, and in many distributions, that's increasingly the case. But removing or sidelining the terminal would also remove one of Linux's defining strengths, its transparency and flexibility. It's worth noting that even within Linux communities, there's diversity. Some distributions, like pop_os, focused heavily on user-friendly design. Others, like Gentoo, Assume a high level of user involvement and customization. The ecosystem accommodates both philosophies. If one approach feels like gatekeeping, another may feel welcoming. So is the Linux terminal just if we define gatekeeping as deliberately restricting access to maintain exclusivity, then no, the terminal is open, documented, and available to anyone. There's no membership card required. There's no hidden fee. In fact, the barrier to entry is often lower than proprietary systems that lock advanced features behind paywalls. If we define gatekeeping more loosely as creating an environment where newcomers feel unwelcome or overwhelmed, then the answer becomes more new. The terminal itself is neutral. It's a tool, but the way it's presented, discussed, and sometimes glorified can contribute to that feeling. Ultimately, the Linux terminal is less about exclusion and more about choice. You can ignore it for as long as your workflow allows. But if you decide to learn it, you gain a level of control and understanding that's hard to match in purely graphical environments. And maybe that's the real story here. The terminal isn't a locked door. It's a lever. It can look intimidating, especially when you first approach it. But it doesn't exist to keep you out. It exists to give you the option to go deeper. Whether that feels like gatekeeping or empowerment depends less on the blinking cursor and more on the culture, expectations, and support surrounding it.